In today's podcast, I have a very special guest in the form of UK Gambling Commission CEO Andrew Rhodes, who joins me now. Andrew, it's great to have you on, and I appreciate you taking the time to come on the pod, especially because there is quite a lot to talk about with your organisation front and centre on almost all of the issues impacting the betting sector right now. So I'm going to do my best today to try and represent those who bet and ask some of the key relevant questions many of them have. But before we get into those topics, do you want to kick us off with a bit of an intro to yourself and what it is you currently do over at the Gambling Commission?
Thanks for inviting me. To be honest, I'm happy to be here. There's, a million and one questions. So we'll try and pick up as many of those as we can. So the Gambling Commission regulates all forms of gambling bar spread betting in Great Britain. We don't cover Northern Ireland. So that's everything from online betting, bingo, casinos, the National Lottery, everything really. The Commission's been around for 16 years and we're a government organisation. We're a government regulator. We've government email addresses. And we've got to deliver against the Gambling Act 2005 and the policy of the government. And gambling is one of those topics that people have got very, very strong views in lots of different directions. So we're often in the middle of some quite difficult debates. And our job is to bring impartial evidence and decision making to what is a really difficult topic.
Appreciate there's lots to get into and is quite challenging and people are very passionate about it. But can you explain a little bit more about the remit of what you do at the Gambling Commission? Maybe an insight into how many people work there, the type of things you actually do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, so there's just over 370 people work at the Gambling Commission. So you've got the usual sorts of functions you'd expect to have in any organisation, and then we've got people then assigned to the operations, so issuing licences, testing people's compliance against those licences where we need to, taking enforcement action. We've got a contact centre that deals with inquiries from the public. We're not an ombudsman, so we don't deal with individual complaints. When you consider that the top 6 gambling operators handle about in the region of 90 billion bets a year, we would have to be a much bigger organisation to be dealing with everybody's individual complaints. But essentially our job is to issue licences for gambling, and there are about 2,400 licensees in Great Britain of varying sizes. It's a very consolidated industry now, but we issue licences, we check compliance against those licences, take action where we need to. Under the Act, we've got to protect children and the vulnerable from harm from gambling, to keep crime out of gambling and ensure gambling is fair and open. But we've also got a remit which is to make sure that, we have an obligation to aim to permit gambling, which means that if you apply for a licence, and providing that what you want to do as an operator is in line with the licensing objectives I just outlined, then we've got an obligation to permit that. So it's a liberalising act when it came in 2005. So we've probably got the most liberalised gambling industry in the world, and it's the largest online gambling industry in the world still. So as a country, it's a very, very big market that we regulate.
So it's a very big remit there. And perhaps it's good to learn a little bit about your own relationship with betting. I read an interview with you recently in the Daily Mail where you actually stated you're someone who likes to bet and that you were moderately successful. What is your own relationship and interest in betting from a personal perspective?
Moderately successful could mean anything, couldn't it? Well, I've been an active bettor for well over 20 years, so it's something I've had a long-held interest in. I mean, I'm never going to trouble an operator's holiday home or anything. I'm not going to make a living out of it. But I haven't deposited for a long time. I haven't needed to. So I'm in the small percentage of people who are generally winning. I just find it really interesting. I have done for a long time. I mean, there are certain things I don't do because they don't interest me. And there's some things in my job now I can't do. So I can't play the National Lottery. I can't go into land-based venues. That's a historical restriction that's on us. But, I've been betting, it used to be betting shops, but increasingly for quite a long time online. For a long time, it's just an interest I've had. And as part of why I was interested in the role when it came up, actually, is something I'd been approached for a role with the Commission a long time before. So it's sort of on my interest list. And when it came up, it's the sort of sector I've always been interested in. Challenging as it can be quite often.
Okay, yeah, because that's interesting to know that you are somebody who enjoys betting, and when you say you're moderately successful, good luck to the Bookmaker employee who decides to restrict or close your account. We might talk about that topic later on.
Well, I think about that quite a bit as well to see what happens. I mean, I'm not on my own in the commission in that sense because there's a lot of people in the commission who are ex-traders, worked in the industry, ex-bookmakers as well. There's a lot of very actively engaged people in the commission. There's people as well who don't bet at all, some for religious reasons, some it just doesn't interest them. But there's quite a lot of active people in the commission because it's a sector that they're interested in, and some of them have worked in the sector, as I say, been traders and been actively involved. It's pretty common within the Gambling Commission.
Okay, that's good to know. Well, let's get into one of the hot topics. We've got quite a lot to explore. Probably the biggest one right now for punters is that of affordability checks, or enhanced financial risk assessments, as they might be termed, which you're currently working on. I believe there's a pilot scheme for its standardized implementation. Where does this currently stand?
So we were ready to publish the consultation response 3 weeks ago, and that would include the call for evidence from, I think it was 2021. We're really waiting for DCMS, who want to get a few other things lined up to go at the same time so that we can publish that. As we said already, because we wanted to get this out in advance, what we'll be doing is piloting the check. So what's going to happen is there's a set of data points that credit reference agencies and others can't currently look at because there's no legal permission to. What we've got is the legal permission to do that. So we need to make a change to the license conditions and codes of practice to enable operators to do that. Then we can start to pilot that data. So the idea behind the check is what you get as an operator is effectively a kind of a risk indicator. So it's not sharing all your banking details and things like that. It's not sharing lots of personal information. It's effectively to get to the point where you get a risk indicator for this person. Most people, they're going to be low risk, aren't they? But it's to get a risk indicator. But creating a frictionless check is actually really, really, really easy. Creating a frictionless check that answers the question that we want to answer is the hard bit. And that's why we need to do the pilot. So we said they will last at least 4 months, and they may well last longer than that. We may well have to get access to extra data sets, because if we find that pilots aren't really answering the question, then we'll need to refine that then, won't we? Because it's really important that if you can introduce something like this, if it can be done, that you get it right.
And is there any idea on the time frame once it's implemented? And I suppose as well, who's going to judge the success or failure of that pilot scheme?
So in terms of timescales, I mean, until we get through the pilot, I couldn't say, because it kind of, if you're doing a genuine pilot and you're saying, well, we want to see how this works with a large sample of data, then until you do that, you can't say how long it will take to implement. Who judges it? Well, that's going to be a combination of the Commission and DCMS. So what we'll need to see from the pilots is how much coverage do we get? Is it as high as we expect it to be? What's the strike rate like in terms of identifying people and giving a meaningful answer? Is that giving sufficient indication as to what an operator should do if someone's been flagged as being of higher risk? That's what we need to work through on it. And once we start to see what that looks like, we'll be able to judge whether or not that's going to answer the question the government wants to answer.
Okay. So the idea is that these checks are going to be frictionless for the majority of customers. Do you have some numbers on that? Because we've seen some figures put forward that would be 3%, which have been debated due to, I believe there's two cohorts, right? There's data, which is about people who lose £1,000 in 24 hours. And then there's £2,000 in 90 days.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that and what you mean by frictionless for the majority of people?
Yeah, so the bit that everybody likes to seize on is for the majority of people, isn't it? So what the white paper said is they estimated that 3% of accounts would be affected by this. So it's not the majority of accounts, but it will be a large proportion of spend. So gross gambling yield is concentrated in a relatively small percentage of accounts. So that's what that initial figure means. Frictionless for the majority? Well, as I say, it's quite easy to deliver a frictionless check. It's whether it answers the question or not. So what we're aiming for here is a high coverage check. Now, the credit reference agencies have a very high degree of confidence that they can deliver this. We'll test that through the pilot and we'll see what that looks like. There is then a policy question that comes is if you've got a cohort of people that can't be found or there is insufficient information, what do we do about that? What does that mean? And that's what the frictionless for the vast majority means. It then brings you a question once you've done the pilot. Well, if we've got whatever that percentage is that can't be detected. And bearing in mind, if you're in the higher spending accounts, you are more likely to have more data reference points anyway. But we will see that through the pilot, whether that holds to be true. And that then gives us an opportunity to see, well, are there any groupings that can't be identified? And if there are, what do we want to do about that?
Yes, but I was going back to what was published in the white paper, and it says 3% of punters who lose £2,000 in 90 days. There's 3.2% impacted, and then 2% of accounts would lose 1,000 in 24 hours. So it could be as many as 5.2%, and that is not people, is it? It's accounts.
It's accounts, yes. Just a smaller number of people, yeah.
Yeah. And does that include anybody that has a bet? So tomorrow is the Grand National, and my mum will probably place her only yearly bet on the Grand National. Would she be included in that sample?
Yeah, so it's accounts that have been active during the last year. So I know people make this point a lot. And what they tend to then move into is, well, it's a much higher proportion of active bettors. Well, yes, that's true. So 0.1% of accounts spend £20,000 a year. Okay. Well, 100% of those would be covered by this.
Yeah.
So as you, of course, go further up the pyramid, well, the number is larger. And this is why I make the point that it might be 3% of accounts, but depending on the nature of the operator, it'll be a much larger proportion of income because gross gambling yield is concentrated in a smaller proportion of accounts. So yeah, it starts to pick up. But we're not talking about dormant accounts where there's no activity at all. But that's the sample size, right? But it is it's obviously going to cover more active bettors. But that's why the point of this is it is frictionless. So it's not asking you to provide documents. It's not asking you to provide sensitive personal information. It is something that takes place in the background, which happens a lot with transactions now. Operators do similar things now. Also, the financial vulnerability check. So this is the one that happens very early on in the process. The white paper says £125. A lot of operators, in fact, most of the big operators already have this in place, looking for people who have got high risk indicators. And a lot of them do it at either about £100 or so of losses, or some do it at onboarding. They do it, as you open an account. And again, it's trying to screen for people who may be at a much higher risk so that they can put things in place to try and manage that from an early point.
Okay, yeah. So we'll probably get onto the topic of friction and frictionless a little bit later. We'll talk about open banking. But I wanted to focus on, talk about the petition and the pushback against affordability, because as you say there, it's in theory a small percentage, whatever that percentage might be, of people that are impacted. But those are the people who drive the most gross gambling yield and the people that generate money for industries like horse racing. And you won't be unaware, I'm sure, of the 100,000 people that signed the petition, the parliamentary debate, the analysis, critical people in the Racing Post and other media organisations. It's almost like a unified voice in many aspects in the betting industry criticising affordability checks. How much, if any, impact has the feedback and the pushback against them had on your proposals? And we've studied them from various angles and really can't see how they will work. We haven't had much feedback from people, our members and people we talked to about them either. Can you explain, are you engaging with, for example, those in the racing industry to hear their concerns? Or is the knock-on effect on sports like, horse racing just collateral damage?
Well, I'll pick horse racing up secondly, because I think there's a broader picture here, and I think it's important that we talk about that. So it depends what people think they're objecting to. So there are plenty of people in the racing industry who say that the current practices by bookmakers are adversely affecting them. So this is where bookmakers have reacted to a series of really bad cases across a lot of operators where people were losing amounts of money that they clearly couldn't afford, and nobody wanted to defend that. So operators have reacted to that. They've always needed to put policies and procedures in place to manage this. I mean, look, spend is only one part of what operators have got to do, right? There's a huge amount of other stuff that takes place that people aren't talking about very much at the moment. They're talking about as though spend is the only thing, and it really isn't. So if the current position is one that people object to, surely a better position is you have something that doesn't involve you supplying any documentation. It doesn't involve you sharing sensitive information. It doesn't affect your credit rating. It doesn't affect your banking status. It doesn't stop you getting a mortgage. It doesn't do any of those things. That takes place without you needing to even touch it, to make sure that you're not someone that is showing some risk. You can be left alone. You can be left alone, whereas currently operators don't have that capability, so they have to do something. That's what the white paper actually proposes. And there are people who are saying, well, you won't be able to do it. Well, okay. Well, in that event, the Secretary of State everybody else has said, if we can't do it and if it can't be done, then it won't be introduced. So we've been really, really clear about that. So what we have here is an objection to the principle, mostly, that there should be any kind of check in place. Bearing in mind, this isn't a limit. This isn't saying you're not allowed to spend your own money. This is about saying we know across all forms of gambling, including in horse racing. You'll have people who are not in control of their gambling that can end up in a really, really bad place. And we have an obligation under the Act to try and prevent that happening. Can never have no risk, can never prevent anything bad ever happening. But what you can do is say, look, there is an opportunity through the massive amount of data that can be accessed in a safe way to try and guard against this. And that's what's being proposed. So the objection to it, quite often, the way it's described isn't actually what the white paper or government is proposing to do. And that's the thing that we've really, really struggled with here, is trying to get across what we're actually saying the government wants to do. It doesn't want you to provide your bank statements. And I get quite a lot of people tweeting me, as I'm sure you're aware. And a lot of the time, they will be talking about what is being experienced by consumers today as though that is what is being proposed in the white paper. And it just isn't. And that's what we're trying to get across to people. And that is what I think the pilot will help us demonstrate. I mean, on horse racing, the effect on horse racing. Well, look, horse racing has a completely different relationship with gambling compared to other sports. Horse racing, 70% of gross gambling yields, so this is gross profits, comes from just 1% of accounts. So that's 5 times higher than other sports betting. So horse racing has a much, much higher reliance on a smaller portion of accounts. The demographic for horse racing is much older. It's much older than it is for, say, football betting. And it's not for the Gambling Commission to really comment on the economics of horse racing. But we can see over time there are arguments about reduced field sizes, best odds guarantees, media rights arguments. And the margin on horse racing for off-course horse racing, once you take out direct costs, is only 2 to 3% for bookmakers. So there is a lot of pressure in the horse racing position anyway. And it's got effectively a declining consumer base. But overall gambling across all forms of gambling is actually consistent. So the number of people who are engaged in gambling has remained pretty static. In fact, it's probably slightly up. The amount of money in gambling is up. For horse racing gross gambling yield, so this is the money coming from bookmakers, it's remained pretty static, actually. And the levy to horse racing has also been, I think it's probably about its highest level for 10 years. Turnover, though, is undoubtedly down. And that can be caused by a number of different things. There's a combination of factors here. And clearly, if you've got social responsibility measures taking place and people who perhaps should have been having an interaction before and weren't, but are now, means that they may be betting less. And that's going to have an effect across any forms of gambling, actually. So horse racing has a unique reliance on it because it is largely funded as a result of money either directly from gambling or the media rights and everything associated with it. And that is just a different kind of arrangement to everything else.
I would take issue with that. It's just a principle thing. I think there's people who think about the feasibility and other aspects of affordability, and we'll probably expand on them a bit later with some other questions. But you mentioned there, like, affordability checks are here already. They have been here for several years. As I understand it, you haven't mandated bookmakers apply affordability checks, but you have told them they need to obviously oversee, make sure you protect your customers. Is there not a degree of frustration from yourself? Or I know there is from industry that there has been no guidelines or oversight in this period where we're still talking about a pilot. I think the initial consultation was going back to 2020. Is there a frustration from your end that it's taking so long and that we have this? Surely there needs to be maybe some guidelines, at least in the interim period, especially if this doesn't work. As you say, it might not actually work. It's very, very difficult to provide some clarity to operators and also consumers about what standardized affordability checks will look like.
So it's a good question. Is there frustration? Well, yes, there is. So, this is a topic that's been around for a while before I joined the Commission. When the Commission was first dealing with this, it reached the point where a lot of people were sort of saying, look, this is a really big policy topic and it's really a matter for the white paper. The Commission shouldn't be trying to address this. And the Commission essentially agreed with that point. So it became part of the Gambling Act review itself. And we know that got delayed a number of times, a lot of different ministers. We got close to publication, or DCMS rather, got close to publication a number of times. And for various reasons, it got delayed. So that took a lot longer than I think anybody anticipated. So that's got a natural frustration with it that, something that we thought was maybe months or a year away ended up being a lot further away than I think anybody originally intended. So is there some frustration there? Yes. And I don't think the Commission could realistically have done anything in that intervening period, largely because everybody was arguing as to whether this should happen at all or not. And I think that is a matter for government policy to decide, because it is such a politicised issue. Is there room for something in between? Well, yes, there is. So we've agreed, or rather the industry has come up with a set of minimum standards and basically an interim measure between now and the full implementation of the white paper, which will set a series of minimum standards around, I'm not going to call it affordability checks because it's not really a judgment like that, but looking at financial risk to reduce the amount of documentation checks that are taking place now, to agree a different kind of risk profile. And the Commission has recognised that standard. So that means it would form part of our compliance work. So if you're adhering to those standards, then we will recognise that. So that would bring consistency of approach to the industry for any operator that decided to adopt the code. They don't have to. They can set different standards. It's still outcomes-based regulation, and I think we should be careful about walking too far away from that. The publication that is pending the Betting and Gaming Council being happy and ready to publish that. And I'd expect that to be coming forward quite soon. Something that we've been working on with the industry for quite a while to try and bring consistency to this area. Because much as operators should and must set their own thresholds and have their own risk assessments as to when they want to do things and why, which will depend on their customer base, because that can vary enormously. The industry wanted to have, agree itself, some consistent standards, and that's exactly what they've decided to do, and we've decided to recognise that standard.
Okay, so a few things pending already, as we've talked about so far. So next I want to ask you just a couple of quick questions about who's in charge of this, the process, if you like. Would you accept then, on the face of things, that the people who stand to gain most from customers gambling more than they can afford to lose are bookmakers? Would you accept that tenet?
Well, there's a few people who could gain from that. People gambling more than they can afford to lose clearly goes into bookmaker profits. But if they're gambling more than they can afford to lose on horse racing, then horse racing benefits, because that goes through in terms of the levy as well.
Yeah, but just in general, it would be bookmakers, because if you're a punter, you lose money, bookmakers win. So accepting that idea, would you also accept that the reason that some people say affordability checks are necessary is because those same bookmakers have too often put profit over their social responsibilities in the past?
Well, we don't regulate consumers, we regulate operators. And I've said this in public a number of times. Why are we here? Why did government want to do something on this? It did something on this because the industry had not put sufficient policies and procedures in place itself to manage the risk of people spending more than they should have done. And that led to a whole load of cases where you've got people spending far, far, far beyond their means. I mean, way beyond what anybody could reasonably spend on that income.
Yeah.
And nobody wanted to defend against that. That is why government has decided to take action in a number of areas. And that's, I think that's fairly obvious.
Yeah, so I just wanted to make those two key points, really. So bookmakers are the ones who gain, and bookmakers are basically the ones who cause that problem. So bearing that in mind, what is it that gives you confidence? Because punters don't have any, and many people don't have any, that bookmakers are now the appropriate front line in the protection of customers who might otherwise bet more than they can afford to.
Well, your two premises. So the first one, in terms of bookmakers, the ones that benefit, well, clearly gambling operators are the ones that benefit and people lose money. But as I said, that can flow through to other places, and it does. Why should bookmakers be trusted with this? Well, this is the obligation on all operators, is to make sure that they adhere to the license conditions. So what we're talking about here, and a lot of people will say, well, bookmakers can't be trusted, so why should we be letting them have financial information? What we're talking about here in terms of what government's proposed is actually them having less financial information than they're requesting now. So it's to basically formalise, you must do these checks at this point as a minimum standard in order to protect consumers, because that has not happened consistently enough in the past, and we want to see that change. The only people who can really do that are the operators, because they're the ones with the relationship with the consumer. They're the ones that have got the obligation to make the assessment as to whether or not this person is exhibiting a higher level of risk. And it's not just on the spend side. So they have to do this in terms of your patterns of play. So if you start staking very differently, you start playing late at night, you start mixing different products, if you have failed deposits, you might have a whole range of other things. They've got an obligation to assess whether that might indicate you are showing signs of elevated risk and they might need to have an interaction with you. That has all been there for many, many years.
Yeah, so obviously the patent of play is clearly there. They can use that, but they're still going to have. I mean, it segues nicely onto the question about open banking, because we've seen some bookmakers start to utilize open banking. There's a company called Bet Budget, apparently from Department of Trust, who are working with Bet365. So do not, and obviously consumers have to go through Bet Budget to show their financial information, presumably which Bet365 can access. So there's a clear example of, in practice so far. I mean, I don't know whether open banking is going to form part of the checks moving forward that are being proposed in the pilot scheme. But in that instance, it would indicate companies like Bet365 have full access to your banking details, as well as obviously having the patents of play. But put that to one side, let's talk about giving bookmakers who have regularly been penalised for failures across the board when it comes to social responsibility and anti-money laundering, being given the responsibility for fixing the problem they've created.
Well, bookmakers have to fix the problem they've created. So that's just a logical point. Consumers decide whether or not to use open banking and whether to allow anyone else to see that. So it's not the Gambling Commission that's doing this. It's not an operator that's doing it. Consumers make that decision. So if you think about open banking, it is an alternative where the consumer makes a choice to share some information. So I don't think under open banking they see everything. Instead of submitting bank statements and other information that the operator may feel they need to see because you've hit a particular threshold, bearing in mind most accounts don't hit that threshold. But it's a consumer choice.
Their choice is adhere to this or you can't bet with us. So it's not really a choice, is it? It's like a, and then we'll probably talk about where they might go from there later on, but it's a choice as in you can bet or you can't. And I understand, looking at, for example, Bet Budget, that in some occasions you have to show 5 years worth of all of your financial information through any bank accounts you hold. So this is not just small excerpts of information. It's access carte blanche to everything personal, financial. I mean, would you share 5 years worth of your personal bank information just to have a bet?
It depends on the circumstances, isn't it? So this is a consumer choice. And of course, what a government wants to do through the frictionless financial risk check is something that doesn't involve having to share all of that information. It doesn't involve having to share personal data about your spending habits. So that's to avoid the sort of thing that you're talking about. You've got a concern here. Obviously, the reason people will ask for information, operators will ask for information, will vary. So it can depend. So it depends whether or not it's because of suspicious activity. Depends whether or not they've got a social responsibility concern. And by the way, you mentioned anti-money laundering failings. I've seen quite a few people comment on this. This isn't because operators were facilitating money laundering. It's because their checks were not robust enough in order to make sure that they had determined what the source of funds had been when there've been very large deposits. That's quite a different thing to facilitating criminality or misusing data. It was that they had not been doing what they should have been doing, which is quite a different concern.
Yeah, but there's a majority of fines which are allowing people to deposit far more than they can afford. Not anti-money laundering, but just making people VIPs and spending more than they can afford. So again, because they're incentivized, because if someone deposited 50,000 which they didn't check on and they were happy for them to deposit and lose it, it's the bookmaker's profit from there on.
But isn't that the reason why government wants to change that? Because the alternative is, there'll be some people who will be absolutely fine, but you'll have people who are being really severely harmed. It brings the industry, it brings the whole idea of gambling into disrepute. So government wants to have something in place which prevents that.
Of course.
But then if you advocate against doing that, what are you left with? You're left with what?
Well, I agree. No, well, nobody wants vulnerable people to lose more. And obviously there are some extreme examples there, but the fear is that the affordability checks, as well meaning as they are going to be counterproductive and aren't actually going to resolve the problem.
Explore that with me. Why would they be counterproductive? So you have let's assume, because I know you might reject the premise that it's deliverable at all. Okay, fine. Right, that's kind of an ideological view. So I accept that. Right. So park that for 1 second. Right. So I'm not going to try and take that view away from you, but let's imagine they can be delivered. Let's imagine it can be delivered. Right, because there's data here that hasn't been used before. So we could, for example, right, and we don't know until we've done all the pilots. Let's say we're flagging someone who's been missing credit card payments, they're defaulting on their mortgage, they've got all kinds of other financial lights going off. Should they be gambling in the top 3% of accounts, right? That's an interesting question. Let's assume this can be delivered, right? If that's delivered and you're not having to share documents, It's taking place in the background. If you've not got any financial distress, whatever, and you're allowed to go on your way, you're not being asked, as you might do now, at a certain spend point, being asked for documents. None of that happens now. You just sail through. But the people who are showing signs of financial risk are then having an interaction and being managed, so maybe preventing them getting into a worse position. How is that counterproductive?
That's the assumption that it's frictionless as well, because majority of the time you go to...
But imagine that, let's disagree for a second, right? Because we're speaking theoretically here.
Okay.
Let's just say it is, because a frictionless check is easy to deliver, right? That's really, really easy. I could do it tomorrow. The question is, will it give the right kind of information for an operator to make a judgment, okay? So let's assume that we can deliver that, and that's what government's committed to. But that's what the Commission's charged with delivering. So let's assume we can deliver that. Why is that counterproductive? And why is that not better than what is happening today?
Well, it's a big leap, isn't it? Because frictionless checks, I know you want me to park that, but we can't, because we haven't seen any evidence that they can actually work. You say yourself, it's very, very difficult to do them all.
But imagine they can. Imagine it does, because you said it might be counterproductive, but we've only said we'll deliver this if it works. Assuming it works and we're delivering it, why is that counterproductive? Why is that not better?
If you could, and it's a big if, you could put through frictionless checks, which wouldn't put up barriers to people to supply personal financial information, as we're seeing with open banking, then in theory, yes, that would work. But what we're seeing at the moment is, for example, there's no evidence that frictionless checks will be in place. And we have things like open banking, which are putting up barriers because consumers need to go and open up a bank or an app and connect their bank account.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
Majority of people won't abide by that. We see that 80% of people, this is not from me, this is operators, several operators have said 4 in 5 of their customers won't share their personal information.
I know. People don't want to. Of course they don't want to.
They're going to go elsewhere.
We're all conditioned to not share our personal information. So I totally get that. We're in violent agreement. Mm-hmm. But your point you made was there's no evidence for frictionless checks will exist. They exist today. Okay? The financial vulnerability check that we're talking about already exists, already happens. Most people don't even realize that they've been subject to it. Okay? That already happens.
That's the initial check.
Yeah, but there are already checks.
That's the light touch financial check.
But there are already checks that different providers can run now with new data sets that we need to pilot. Now, my point is, will it give enough of a risk assessment for an operator to be able to make a judgment? I think that's the interesting policy question.
Sure.
But it is perfectly possible to deliver a frictionless check. If your starting point is, well, frictionless checks aren't possible, well, okay, but what are you left with then? You've left with the status quo. Or you say, well, this is a level of friction that nobody wants. I agree, nobody wants friction. Of course they don't. Then what do you do then? You're in a right old mess, aren't you? Because then you have, well, either we have to have a series of friction points in place, which will catch people who don't need to be caught. They don't have a problem. They're spending well within their means. There's no issue here at all. But we're actually searching for a group of people who we do need to have an intervention with. So we're trying to build a reverse trawler net here. And frictionless checks allow you to do that. If they don't work, well, they don't work then, in which case they won't be implemented. But we've still got a problem to solve. Mm-hmm. But if your premise is, oh, well, it just won't work. Well, there's no evidence to say that it won't, because checks already exist today. What isn't proven yet and needs to be proven, and I'm sure it'll be an iterative development through the pilot, is whether there is a check that gives sufficient risk assessment information or a risk score to an operator that allows them to know whether this person can just proceed and just be left alone until a later point, which may well be, for a completely different reason or not. That is what we want to pilot. And that is perfectly possible. It's perfectly possible. I mean, these things are available now. It's just a question of whether they give quite enough information and whether they match well enough, which is something we've got to test.
I want to tell you about the launch today of SmartBash 2024 and how you can now purchase tickets to this unique event. Now, the SmartBash 2024 is a one-day ticketed event that's being held at Chelsea FC in London, England on Friday, the 19th of July. You can now purchase tickets. Prices are starting at £99 to begin with for those of you purchasing today. And I'm just really excited. It's going to be a one-day special event We're going to feature some of the best and brightest minds of the betting world. This event is designed for those of us who bet, those of us who enjoy betting and do so, either we already do it profitably or are aspiring to do so profitably. If that includes you, then you are more than welcome to join us at SmartBash while tickets are available. We're going to have a variety of speakers, panelists and experts who will be providing information, discourse, maybe doing some presentations on some of their edges. So it's an opportunity, like I say, to learn from some of the best and brightest minds. Just anyone and everyone that works in this field and has information and edges and angles to share that can really help push your betting forward or educate you further. And that's really the goal of the SmartBash event. The second key reason to attend SmartBash is connecting with others who work in this space. Now, whether you are somebody who works alone or you have an interest in betting that you're developing yourself and you're yet to really meet others in the space, or you are someone firmly established as a professional bettor, you'll have the opportunity to come to this event and meet others who are doing exactly the same. So the event itself, say, is going to be a one-day event from around 10 a.m. in the morning to 4:30 p.m. in the afternoon at Chelsea FC. We're going to have food and drinks for the lunch we provide. We'll have teas and coffees throughout the day. Breakout room for you to go and meet other people and have a coffee with them and to learn more. And then in the evening, we're also going to have a drinks event at Frankie's Bar, which is connected to Chelsea. And you'll be able to, again, have a few drinks into the evening and continue those conversations. So tickets themselves are priced at £99 to start off with. And it's been run by the Smart Betting Club in conjunction with our friends over at Bookie and Matchbook. Don't be worried if you don't know anybody else there. There'll be a lot of people in the same boat. And we're trying to be inclusive to anybody that wishes to come in, whether you're a big, small punter, new, experienced. We want to see you at SmartBash. So you can go to the website, which is smart-bash.com. Links to tickets will be on there. It's going to be across the socials and emails of SBC, Bookie and Matchbook. Now, we're actually scheduled the event to take place the week after the Euro 2024 finals. So who knows? We could be celebrating an England Euros victory at the event as well. I really look forward to seeing you at SmartBash 2024. Okay, let me ask you then about open banking, because that is out there now. And Charles Cohen, who runs the Department of Trust, part of Bet Budget, now sits on your industry board. Is that a sign that open banking will be part of this process? Can you expand on that at all?
Oh, well, Charles Cohen, he's a member of the Industry Forum. There are lots of different members of the Industry Forum chaired by Nick Rust. The Industry Forum is essentially, it comments to the Commission on different topics. That doesn't mean that anybody is in a decision-making position, because they're not. So open banking has been around for a long time. We use open banking data to understand what consumers are doing with gambling. So, for example, it's shown us that there has been a displacement from larger operators in the last few years into tier 3 and 4 operators. So it's very useful in that sense. It's up to individuals whether they want to sign up to open banking and use it or not. It's available to them as a way of avoiding having to do certain things with documentation, but it's a consumer choice. And it's available now, and people have been using it in different places for quite a long time.
But will it be part of what you perceive and part of the pilot and part of the process moving forward? Is it being considered?
Well, open banking is being considered because it's around now and it's being used already. So it may well have a role to play. But you also have to recognise that not everybody wants to use open banking. Not everybody wants to sign up to it. So, of course, it's part of the picture. But, with consumers, some people will say yes to some things and not to others. So we're talking here about, in terms of gambling consumers, about 22.5 million people will gamble with some regularity. What those different people think will be hugely diverse across that population. So some will be happy to do some things and others won't be.
Yeah, well, I think most people won't be happy to do open banking, but we've talked about that enough, and I realise there's other things we need to get into. Especially, I want to ask you about the black market, another hot topic. 7 months ago, when questioned by MPs at the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, you said this, talking to a lot of people around the industry and in the GB market. Actually, the size of the black market is very small, but estimates do vary. Every time I've heard someone say to me, based on what's happening here, people are going to the black market, I have asked them the same question, tell me where. And I have not once had an answer. I've not once been given the name of an operator or a person or a location or anything I can act upon. And I've consistently asked that question every time. So that's your quote to MPs. Since then, the online intelligence company YieldSec have presented data that shows a substantial increase in black market gambling, with it now being responsible for up to 4% of the total market in the UK. We've also seen reports of unlicensed firms, private layers growing in stature. The Racing Post investigated one they published just before Cheltenham Festival. So I want to ask you, has your view changed in this area since that quote 7 months ago? And how real a threat do you feel the black market is right now in the UK?
If you're going to quote me, then quote me in full. So at that select committee hearing, I also set out in detail a lot of the activity that we've been undertaking to address the illegal market. So the point that I made there is lots of individuals have said to me, anecdotally, I know of customer X who's no longer betting and they've gone to the black market. And I've said, okay, where have they gone to? Well, I don't know. I can't say. They just tell me they have. That's the point I made at the select committee, which is absolutely true. In fact, more recently, people have started to provide intelligence of operators, illegal ones, or WhatsApp betting groups that they believe people have gone to. So that's starting to flushing things out. In the same select committee hearing, I set out in detail a lot of the activity we'd done with Google, with web disruption, on illegal lotteries, and a range of other things. So it's not fair or true, as some people have tried to do, to say that I said, oh, I've never heard of any, right? That's just nonsense. Has my view changed? Well, do you know how the yield sec methodology works and how they've calculated that number?
No.
So yield sec actually don't reveal very much about how that they've arrived at. Well, obviously, we've met with them. We met them a number of times. Yield sec's previous estimation on the illegal market was the mass majority of illegal market growth was from the self-excluded and children, worryingly, okay? So the most vulnerable. And it was effectively illegal casinos targeting. As far as I understand it, yield sec's methodology, and this may not be right because it's actually quite hard to get to the bottom of it, assumes things like dwell time and deposit limits on the illegal market will be the same as the legitimate market. And there's quite a lot of anecdotal evidence that says that's probably not true. So they're making an estimate based on a series of assumptions and assumptions upon assumptions. And I'm not going to knock them for that because it's actually very hard to estimate an illegal activity because people generally don't tell you about what they're doing. We know as well from our own research that quite a lot of people who thought they'd gambled illegally hadn't when we asked them what the websites were that they'd used. So it's an area that's quite difficult. Have I revised my position? No, my position's been really consistent. So what I've said is in every speech I've made in, probably the last 2 years, that illegal gambling is a risk, and you have to address that risk. And if you displace people from the legitimate industry because they are gambling in an uncontrolled way, then they're not just going to stop. And the illegal market will also target people for a range of other reasons as well. Okay, they will look for vulnerable people. They'll have a lack of control. So the chance of you getting your money back out of it is probably pretty slim as well. So we've been doing a huge amount of work to combat illegal gambling. So we've seen that every time we target an illegal site, we see traffic fall. But of course, another one opens up. We know that's an issue. Google have delisted over 7,000 websites from search results, so it's getting harder to find them. We've got internet service providers blacklisting domains and sites. Now, we know they get recreated. We know all of this, right? But it is definitely frustrating traffic. PipCoo, who monitor illegal online activity, have seen quite a big fall in illegal gambling sites in their activity. But there's still a lot of them out there, right? There's still a lot of work to be done. Criminal justice bill will give us a new power to make it much easier and quicker for us to get sites blacklisted at ISP level so we don't have to go through a lengthy court order process. So there's a lot of work that's going on in this area. One of the areas, you mentioned the Racing Post. I did an interview with Bill Barber just after the BGC conference a couple of weeks ago. And quite a few people misquoted me on it. But Bill's article is entirely fair and faithful. And what I said in it is illegal WhatsApp groups are the biggest challenge because they are. Because they're very hard to get into. They're a small community of people who are all known to each other. And until somebody gets ripped off, the regulator's unlikely to hear about it. But we have been picking up increasing intelligence from different groups about these groups. So we've got all sorts of activity underway. So I've never said there is no black market. I've never said the black market doesn't present a risk. I've never said any of those things. I've always said it's presented a risk. But we're talking about maybe 2+ years ago when people were arguing against regulation in the white paper at all and saying, it'll drive huge this, that, the other. And I thought that was an overstated argument. And I still think it was. But that doesn't mean illegal gambling isn't a problem. Of course it is. Recently, we had a raid in, not far from me actually, in South Wales, which came directly as a result of intelligence supplied by the industry to us. And we found an illegal gambling den with cash, gold, all sorts of things there. And there have been several arrests. So it's not like there is no activity. But I think you have to take things as a whole. Also, I've seen some really interesting threads on Twitter where people have been talking about different legal websites. And then what emerges quite quickly afterwards when people say, oh, well, there was no EDD, there were no checks, etc., and they're kind of, some of them are extolling the virtues of that. Quite rapidly, you start seeing stories of how people can't get their money out. And illegal sites don't want winning punters either.
Of course not. No.
They do not want winning punters.
No.
Simple as that.
Don't use them. I agree. Don't use them. But so you say you don't believe that the black market in the UK is growing or has grown in recent?
No, I'm not saying that. The black market in the UK will grow because it's being targeted. If you have an illegal industry, right, which is targeting lots and lots of different countries, there's no reason why it wouldn't target the UK. More people are taking action in terms of controlling their gambling than they used to. That means there will be more people who will be self-excluded, which means they're going to prey upon them. But it's not only going to be them, right? The Racing Post has run so many front pages about illegal gambling and raising the profile of it. I'm not sure that was entirely helpful, but I do get the point that they wanted to make. You will find...
Andrew, aren't they speaking to their audience who are interested in the topic because they can't get a bet on, especially racing punters?
That's a different issue, though.
It is. It's an issue for their audience, their readers, and people who are interested in a sport like racing.
Of course it is.
Who are moving to the black market.
Well, hang on, are they though? So what I just said to you is I understand why they are raising that point. I'm not saying that it is not a concern for them, but it is much harder to determine exactly what is happening with the illegal market, which is why it's a big part of our research program. That's why you've got to look at the actual data, but it's very difficult to do. YieldSec have got one methodology. It will have its flaws, as any methodology will. Do I think the UK black market is growing? It is. Right, all illegal markets are growing to some degree, okay? Is it a massive thing now? No, it's not. So when you talk to a lot of people in the industry, they will say, no, it isn't huge. It's certainly nothing like you see in other parts of Europe. But that doesn't mean we aren't concerned about it, which is why we're doing a lot of work on it. Actually, the team dealing with illegal markets, the fastest growing team in the Commission, is something that I said we were going to focus on harder than the Commission did in the past. And I think that's the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. If you displace anyone from the legitimate market, unless they decide to stop gambling, which is probably not that likely, they can be displaced somewhere else. Now, the whole being able to get a bet on thing, that's quite a different issue, because that can happen for a whole range of reasons, including commercial factors, which have absolutely nothing to do with financial risk checks or anything else. That's a different kind of issue. And that could be far more related to the margins for certain products and savvy punters. And I completely understand the frustration there.
Obviously, we recognise that the Gambling Commission takes what you're saying, the black market threat, very seriously, and you're doing a lot of work and you're increasing the number of staff and resources available to tackle that. But when you look at countries like China, the ultimate surveillance state, they aren't able to contain their black market. And there are operators, including some that are licensed here, who seem to serve their sizable market. What makes you think that you can succeed where China is failing? As much as you take Google to get involved and all the things to expedite removal, there are just a flood of websites, and that's not including, the WhatsApp groups as well. What makes you think that you can succeed where countries like China have failed?
Do you know a lot about what China are doing on illegal gambling?
Obviously, I've just read some of the articles. There was an article in preparation for this that talked about the amount of money that is bet in China, but please do tell me more. Okay,
so China will approach things in different ways, obviously, right? There is a difference between gambling, which a state says, any activity actually, which a state says is prohibited, versus something which is neither prohibited or allowed. China approaches gambling in its own way, right? That is not necessarily anything like the approach in the UK market, right? And there are operators licensed here who are in many jurisdictions around the world. Some have opted to not be in any grey markets at all. Some operators here are the black market in other countries. Yeah. But our licenses are only valid for this country, okay? So we don't offer portable licenses. We have had regulators in other jurisdictions where you can and do need to apply for a license come to us to say you've got operators out of the GB market who are operating here without a license. And we have spoken to those operators and they've regularized that position. China's not made any such approach to us, and I would be surprised if it did. China's approach to gambling is far, far more complex and different to the way that it's approached in Europe and in the UK, which has a highly regulated market. China might be the ultimate surveillance state, to use your words, but how it decides to approach illegal gambling is a very different thing. I don't think you can manage wholly an illegal market. That its very nature is you can't. Our job has got to be to prevent illegal gambling at scale. And that's why we focus on things like payment providers to prevent money moving, search engines, internet search providers. That's why WhatsApp groups are really, really difficult for us, because it's not at scale and it's really difficult to penetrate. We have had some successes with it, but it's at the very harder end of what we're doing. If the point that you want to make on the podcast is you can't control the black market, I agree with you. You can't control all illegal activity. I can think of 1,000 things that are illegal that there are laws against, but you can't control all of it. What you do is manage it as best you can.
It's not less that point, Andrew, just more that more people are going to be using and are using the black market in response to some of the issues that we've talked about previously. And therefore, we've seen its growth. It's been small because then that would suggest we've had effective measures in place and effective regulation. And now as people are, as we talked about the Racing Post, more interested in that. And yeah, I don't want to go too much further onto this because I know we've got other topics to talk about. We'll leave that one there. We'll park that one if we can, because I do want to. Well, I've got some time left in this pod to ask you about bookmakers and their reputation. There are a lot of people who are listening to this who are really, really fed up with how bookmakers are treating them. You won't be, again, unaware of the complaints about how they are withholding funds. Now, you've got license condition 17 that says a request made by a customer to withdraw funds from their account must not result in a requirement for additional information to be supplied as a condition of withdrawal if they could have requested that earlier. But yet we are seeing transgressions against that all the time. Is it right that an operator shouldn't ask for customer information like source of funds on withdrawal if it could have asked for that information earlier?
I mean, that's very clear. So if it could have asked for it earlier, then it should have done. And there's actually a number of cases where we've taken action on that point. Look, there are a number of things happening at the moment. So there's certainly a lot of noise and chatter about this. So I've looked into a couple of individual cases personally in the last few weeks where people have raised this to understand what happened with those cases and what the issues were. There's definitely an issue with concerns in the betting industry about multi-accounting, abuse of bonuses, identity issues, people using other people's accounts. Look, I'm in Telegram groups and I see people doing it all the time, right? People talking about how they've used their girlfriend, wife's, somebody else's account, etc. And operators are trying to guard against that sort of risk. If they perceive that someone's got an unusual betting pattern, then they might take action about that. I'm not saying that's true of everyone. I did raise this with the industry well over a year ago in terms of withdrawal levels. And I've seen the data of the largest operators in terms of how fast their withdrawals are coming out. So about 99% of all withdrawals are happening within a day or hours. But of course, 1% of a big number is a big number. Mm-hmm. And what we are seeing in that is there's a mixture of people having issues due to different payment methods. So apparently there's some sort of issue with Apple Pay. I don't use Apple Pay, so I don't really fully understand it, but these other things. And then you've got issues where there are concerns about whether this person is who they say they are. What I set out in a speech that I made in November of last year, and it's not the first time I've said it, is I expect the industry to become much more transparent with consumers about why they're being asked for information and why things are being withheld. Now, they can't always do that. Because if you've got, as I saw in a case recently, if you've got someone that an operator suspects has used forged documents, they've got to refer that, right, as a suspicious activity report. So they can't tell the consumer that. But if, for example, it's, well, there is this issue with your payment method, or I want to understand that you are who you say you are, because there's some reason to suspect you might be, then I think they need to be much more upfront about that. Your assertion was this is now commonplace. Well, it's certainly the most complained about issue. As we get further into it, what we are seeing is a shift in the last, I would say at least a year, into more disputes about withdrawals. But also we have seen a significant increase in the level of criminality and attempted criminality as well, in terms of people trying to use the gambling industry to validate stolen IDs, etc., etc. So the industry has got to try and deal with that. My concern here, which I set out in public a number of times, is in doing that, the industry is not making sure that it's not adversely catching people who it shouldn't be. And I've been really clear that the industry's got to get better at this. And that will be a focus in terms of our fair and open objective, which is one of the licensing conditions over the next year. So I get the frustration. And if you could have asked for the information at an early point, you should have done. And in fact, we have taken enforcement action where people's terms and conditions aren't fair. There was one case in particular where they stated, we'll ask you for documentation at withdrawal. You can't do that. You have to have a legitimate reason to, otherwise you're in breach of the license conditions, and we will take action against you.
So there is very much though a suspicion. We're interested in reading about the penalties, and I haven't seen any blog posts or news press releases about that. And that's part of frustration that people see there's no action being taken. What kind of handle are you monitoring this? Are you talking to? Because there are absolutely lots and lots of examples where bookmakers are taking that money, verifying ID, and then come to withdrawal, and they're asking not just for ID and extra documentation. We've seen all kinds of requests for selfies and asking for unredacted bank statements. And not just that, but woeful customer service. And then when people raise that with organizations like yourself, there doesn't seem to be any interest in that. Is there an approach? Is there something going to be coming forward perhaps in the future whereby you're going to be more proactive on this?
So there's a couple of things to unpack in there. So, anything we've done on this, we publish, right? So that's all out there. I think a lot of people, I see it on social media all the time, make all kinds of assumptions about what the Commission is and isn't doing, and they're often really, really wrong. People's opinions are one thing, right? Everybody's entitled to their opinion. But I see lots of people assert the Commission doesn't do this, doesn't do that, and they're plain wrong, right? So we publish all this information. We don't regulate service. We don't regulate customer service. It's not in our remit. We're not an ombudsman. So we do get a lot of people who will contact us and say, Operator X is awful. They shouldn't be behaving like they give terrible service. I'm afraid that's not a regulatory issue. Okay. And I know that people get frustrated with that because people just assume if you're the Gambling Commission, then you regulate everything to do with gambling. And that's not in our remit. And we can't do things that aren't in our remit, which is why we have, said in our published advice, there should be an ombudsman. There should be, we said there should be a statutory ombudsman that represents gambling consumers in terms of their issues with gambling operators, because it's a huge business. We think that should happen. We've looked into quite a lot of cases that get referred to us. As I say, I've looked into several myself recently where people are stating that I've had to do this, that, the other. The reality is it's a complicated picture. So quite a few of those cases we've looked into, there were good reasons why the operator had asked for more information. And some of them is because they're trying to guard against certain issues. They've set out why they asked the questions. And because the issues have been, the concerns have been allayed, they've then paid the money out. What I've said is I need the industry to be far more transparent in this area. So I do expect things to change, but it's complicated because You and I both know, I'm sure you know as well as I do, there are lots of people out there that are trying to find different ways to use other people's accounts, multi-accounting and proxies and all those sorts of things, which we know goes on, and the industry is trying to guard against it. The problem with that is that will start to catch people who don't need to be caught. And there has to be a more sophisticated approach to finding people who are effectively committing fraud by misrepresentation. That is an abuse of the terms and conditions, and the industry is within its rights to prevent people doing that. That can, however, have other consequences, and I want to see that balance be struck better than it maybe is being struck now.
Well, I would agree that I wouldn't encourage anyone, to multi-account, or if they do so, they take their own risks, and, and therefore they're at their behest of what might come from that. And if they get away with it, fair enough. If they get caught, well, that's on them. They're not talking about that. We're talking about genuine issues, and there's a huge suspicion based on, not just anecdotal evidence. I had Harry Stewart Moore, the lawyer, who came on and talked about the number of issues he sees on this front, that betting companies are using this as a ruse to stop paying out people, and therefore there is a subset of people, and maybe it is only 1%, but they'll probably be the 1% who win, who feel that they can't trust your organization to tackle these problems, and that bookmakers are taking advantage of this. And they don't see any evidence or news, or, perhaps it's great that you're coming on the podcast today, but there is no front foot communication to explain this kind of process to bettors, those people complaining that actually, yes, we are taking regulatory action. We are investigating these issues. So do you understand that frustration? Are you aware of the amount of people who believe that this is going on, and that bookmakers are gaming the system here because you're allowing it to take place?
Of course, I'm aware of people saying that. Are we allowing it to take place? No. This is the point, right? So I see stuff all the time, which really does go into the realms of conspiracy theories. But I can tell you now that when we get cases referred into us, so we're not an ombudsman, so we don't resolve individual cases. But I can say that in terms of all that information we receive, we do analyse it. So I've spoken to operators who've had a spike in complaints about withdrawals, and they've needed to explain what they're up to. They needed to fix things. People have needed to change terms and conditions. So we do act. What we don't do is live tweet our work. So what you've got on social media is an echo chamber, and lots of people sort of agreeing with each other and saying things. And some of that stuff, when you actually look at the case detail, isn't quite what people described. But people do believe the industry is game it. I mean, look, logic tells you that the only people they're going to resist a withdrawal for are winners, because you can't resist a withdrawal of a loser, right?
Mhm.
So it's only going to be people who are trying to withdraw money where they will believe they have a reason to question that. Now, I've actually written to Henry about his case. I wrote to him a little while ago, because I'd like to understand a little bit about what he's seen in some of those to see whether there is an issue there or not. So we pay a lot of attention what's out there. And so we look into an awful lot of cases and we take action with operators. We publish everything that we do in terms of our enforcement work. What we don't do is give a running commentary. So somebody the other day tweeted about a particular operator. I won't name them. We looked into it. We've had conversations with the operator. We've seen the account. We've looked at all of that sort of detail. But I don't sit there and tweet about it, because that would be amazingly inappropriate. So the action takes place. We typically publish things when they come to a conclusion. But in the kind of 10-minute cycle frequency of social media, it's really hard to intervene in that. And also, it's a very difficult space. So I do recognise that consumers think that operators, are taking the proverbial. And there will be examples, and say we've taken action when we've seen it, where operators haven't behaved in the right way. The vast majority of consumers don't have any issue in withdrawing their funds. If you've deposited and withdrawn into the same account.
Well, because they're losers. You've
No,
already mentioned that.
winners.
They're losers.
No, well, if they're withdrawing, then they've won money. You can't withdraw a negative balance.
Well, long-term losers.
Well, they may be, they may not be. I've not had a problem withdrawing, and I'm a long-term winner. And that was before I worked for the commission. So, look, you can come on a podcast and go, well, anybody who wins has their withdrawal frustrated. I mean, that's just not true. That can't be true.
Well, I'd say you're more likely than not to come into conflict if you are a long-term winner, and based on the checks that bookmakers run.
Well, you might do for commercial reasons. I mean, I see plenty of examples of business being refused. I'm afraid that's consumer law.
Yeah.
Okay, that is consumer law. If any business, in fact, doesn't want you as a customer, they can refuse you, so long as it's not because of a protected characteristic. And I know people get upset when I say that, but if a betting shop said, I'm not going to take your bet because you're black, that's clearly unlawful.
Yeah.
But if you don't want to take someone's business because they're not commercially viable for you, I'm afraid they can do that. That's consumer law. And I'm afraid there's nothing we can do about that.
I was going to ask you about restrictions and closures, but I knew that would be the answer, so I didn't. For those listening, it was something I did think about, but because it's consumer law, there's literally no point to do so.
Well, it's not something the Commission can't legislate, right? So we don't have legislative powers. So we couldn't introduce a law anyway. And if we did, you've got to think, this has a wider effect on the market than you might imagine. But it would be a wholesale change to consumer law. It was something that government explored doing the development of the white paper and did not want to do. It would be a significant shift in consumer law. So I do understand, talk to people quite often, they're hugely frustrated that they can't get a bet on anymore. But I'm afraid the operators judge that they're not commercially viable. And I think the margins in horse racing, potentially, I don't know, might make that a bit more likely, but that's hard to say.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I'm going to wrap up shortly, but you mentioned at the start of the podcast, actually, obviously we got the information about the pilot. You did mention the call for evidence, the findings from that. Are they going to be published soon? That was 2020.
Yeah, no, they'll be published at exactly the same time. So I said this to the select committee before last that I did. Quite a few people sort of poking me about that. We said at the time we would publish it all together. So as I say, that was ready to go 3 weeks ago. So we're waiting for DCMS want to get a few things together and try and publish them all at once. So it'll all go out at the same time. I don't think anybody's going to be very surprised by what's in that, really. But yeah, that will all come out at the same time, just as we said it would.
Okay. That's good. And obviously coming on today, is this part of a shift? Because, I feel like I'm on the betting enthusiast side of the fence, and many of those people in that area, especially some of even voluntary groups like Justice for Punters, I know the Gamblers Consumer Forum, for example, they feel they've struggled to gain an audience with the Commission, even to have dialogue like this, where maybe we disagree on things, but at least we talk about it. Is this part of a new, or there going to be more open dialogue with industry groups that represent people who bet? Because I know you obviously spoke at the BGC conference, you speak with them regularly, you pose in front of the bus with the Gambling with Lies groups, for example. Are we going to be able to, the people who bet, the people I purport to represent, likely going to have more open dialogue with the Gambling Commission?
I didn't impose a threat of a Gambling with Lies bus. It was a campaign against gambling ads that I agreed to meet. I meet lots of different groups. So I've met with the Horse Racing Bettors Forum. I meet with all sorts of people, not just me, but across the Commission, have done for the last few years. I think one of the things to bear in mind is some groups would like to spend time with the Commission and talk to them. But if your starting approach is being really quite abusive, as some are, you're less likely, frankly, to get time with us. There are people that we have to talk to because we have to talk to them. There are others that we don't have to, but it might be useful. But it's got to be a constructive dialogue. And, I'm not going to comment on any particular groups that you mentioned, but some aren't constructive. So it's very difficult to have that dialogue. That's what I think is very, very sad about how Twitter is now. When I first started doing this job, albeit a lot of people said I wouldn't be able to sustain it, and they were right, I wanted to be able to respond to questions and queries. But unfortunately, it's reached the point where a relatively small number of people are just really disruptive, and they don't want to hear what you've got to say. And I think that's a shame. So, I've done a number of different things. Every speech I give, any event I go to, any forum, I always say I'll take questions from people. They don't always schedule them, but I'll always talk to a range of people, as will everybody else. And we pay attention to what a lot of people say. So I'm very happy to do this today. You and I aren't going to agree on everything. And I'm sure, when you publish this, there'll be a whole load of people tweeting all sorts of stuff, and I'll get a load of criticism, and maybe you will, because you haven't been nasty enough to me. You didn't say X, Y, Z, right? Hey, look, that's the environment that we live in. But I'll say this. Gambling is an activity enjoyed by tens of millions of people, the enormous majority of which don't have an issue. But some people do, and that can be incredibly severe. And we've got a job to try and strike the balance between people who don't need to have any interference at all and people who need to be protected. That's really hard to do because it's not predictable, it's not easy to spot, it's hard, and people have got lots of opinions on it. But my obligation and my objective is to try and strike that balance as well as I can. A whole load of people will say I've got it wrong, right? And others will say you should be taking licenses away from operators, and some will say there should be no gambling at all. It's that kind of landscape. But personally, I've been actively involved in betting. I mean, there's some things I don't do, so I don't want to. For a long time, I find it interesting. Lots of people in the Commission do. But it's a hard job. And we've got an obligation to talk to as many people as possible. 40,000 people have been involved in our research in the last small number of years, people in focus groups. We talk to a lot of people. What we try and do is get more of that out there in the public domain so people understand and see that. But I think it's just quite difficult to do in the current environment, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, especially on Twitter, I see some of that, and I appreciate what you're saying. But I was actually going to wrap up and say we actually have announced an event in London called SmartBash in July. It's going to feature a lot of people who bet regularly and enjoy it as a pursuit, and I'm sure there'll be lots of people who'd love to engage with you. So, just throwing this in front of you now, but there's an open invite there if you or someone from representatives from the Gambling Commission wish to join, because I know there'll be a lot of people who'd be keen to speak to representatives. But like I say, I appreciate you coming on. Although we might not agree on every topic, it's good to have that open dialogue. And I wish you very well navigating all the challenges in front of you, and really do appreciate your time today. Many thanks, Andrew.
No, thanks for having me on. I genuinely really appreciate you taking the time and giving me the space and throwing the questions at me. It's really good of you.